As far as I know, there has never been an independent expert examination of voting system source code in the United States, which is really surprising given the importance of it and the impact that it has. So when a large company, say Bank of America, buys a new payroll program, then they insist on having the source code. And the vendor says, well, that's proprietary. If it gets out, then our competitors might take unfair advantage of us. And so what they do is make the bank sign a non-disclosure agreement and say, we'll keep the source code, and as long as your company is still in business when we need maintenance or modifications, I mean, after all, Congress is going to change the tax rates. The program is going to require modification. As long as your company is still in business, we'll come to you for the modifications. But if you go out of business, then we have to have a copy of the source code so that our programmers could then pick up where they needed to and continue to maintain the program. So the voting machine software is typically escrowed with the Secretary of State when a state decides on what vendors are going to be approved for that particular state. North Carolina specifically provides in their law that any political party can examine that source code. And so the Libertarian Party claimed that right and said, yes, we would like to examine the source code for the 2020 election. And so they hired a computer expert whom I know professionally, who's a retired computer science professor, and then asked the State Board of Elections in North Carolina to allow their expert to examine the source code. And the response was, well, we don't have any procedures to do that. And before we can write procedures, we need to have hearings. And before we can have hearings, we need to post notices. And it was 6 or 8 months before they got through the notice and the hearings and the procedures. And by the time they got done with it, the expert that the Libertarian Party had engaged said, there's no way I can do the job given the rules that you've come up with. To top it off, the Libertarian Party had run out of money to pay him for the project. But that's what happened in North Carolina. So we came close to having a look at it. But as far as I know, no independent expert has ever examined voting machine source code in the United States. The cast vote record actually has a very simple definition in the federal regulations. And that definition is, quote, an electronic record of a voter's selections. So an electronic record, for example, could be a computer file like a spreadsheet. And in the spreadsheet, every row represents one ballot. So the first row is the first ballot. There's no name, address. There's nothing to identify the voter. It's just the first ballot that got counted voted this way. And the second row in the spreadsheet says the second ballot voted this way. And so the complete spreadsheet then is simply an electronic record, a computer file that records how every ballot voted.
Why is it important?
It's important for a lot of reasons. In order to have confidence in the election process, it has to be auditable. And to be auditable, you have to be able to trace results back to the original records. So if you have a list of how every ballot voted in a spreadsheet, anyone can count how many people in the president column voted for Trump, how many voted for Biden, how many voted for Jorgensen, how many voted for Hawkins, and so forth, and see if counting the ballots on the spreadsheet matches the results that were posted. And in fact, San Francisco, the most liberal city in a very liberal state, posted their cast vote record online. Austin, Texas, again, the most liberal city in a not so liberal state, posted their cast vote record online because it's a public record. It doesn't have anything to identify a voter, but it's the information that allows everyone to verify that the number of votes in precinct 17 in the cast vote record, here are the 17 ballots spread throughout that from that precinct, and the number of votes for a particular candidate matches the final total. So it allows everyone to audit and check the results. It also allows the detection of certain anomalies which you can only get by having the sequence the votes were counted. So hand counts are important. Recounts are important. Risk-limiting audits are important. But they all only look at the final total. They don't look at the sequence of votes. And it's in the sequence of votes that anomalies that are likely manipulation can be detected. One simple example, in the Maricopa County audit, which the state Senate did, one of the citizen auditors gave an interview, and she said, the box of ballots that I went through to inspect was 7 Biden, 1 Trump, 7 Biden, 1 Trump, 7 Biden, 1 Trump, 7 Biden, 1 Trump. People do not line up that way at a polling place. Any kind of detective work involves at least looking for something that's there that's not supposed to be, or something that is not there that is supposed to be. So when you see a pattern like 7 Biden, 1 Trump, 7 Biden, 1 Trump, 7 Biden, 1 Trump, that's a pattern that's not supposed to be there. When you see random, unsorted mail-in ballots, which the Maricopa official in charge of the election agreed that the mail-in ballots were random, there should be no discernible pattern in the sequence. And what that means is after the initial fluctuations due to a small number of ballots counted so far, you should very quickly settle down to the final average. This is why quality control works. This is why polling works. So Maricopa County has over 2 million registered voters. Someone's running for office. They do not make 2 million phone calls and say, do you mind telling me who you plan to vote for? They make 400 phone calls at random. Because if that random sample is representative of the whole county, then with 400 phone calls, they can get the percentage who are going to vote for each candidate plus or minus 3 or 4%. Candidate says, well, I want a more accurate poll. Okay, call 1,000 people. You don't have to call 2 million people if the sample, because the sample is random. It doesn't matter which 1,000 you pick, as long as there was no pattern to the way you picked it. And so when the pattern is not random, in this case, we saw a 2-to-1 slope that was not only not flat like it ought to be, but it was very tightly controlled. So if you count the first 25,000 ballots and Biden has 75% of them, and then you count another 25,000 ballots, so now you've counted 50,000 ballots, what will his percent be? It might be higher, it might be lower. It depends on that second batch of 25,000 ballots. In other words, you could not bet on it and say, I know that if I count another 25,000 votes, it's always going to be higher. It's always going to be higher. It's always going to be higher. It's like flipping quarters, and you say, well, I know it's going to be heads, 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 heads. Something's wrong with that. And that's what happened in Pima County, Arizona. Is if you took blocks of 25,000 votes and then counted another 25,000 and another 25,000, the cumulative proportion went 75, 74, 73, 72, 71, 70. That can't happen in a fair election with unsorted mail-in ballots. As I said, the cast vote record provides the sequence in which the ballots were tabulated. And in order to protect privacy, it's standard for the voting machine companies to scramble them within blocks of 100 or 200. So the first 100 rows are shuffled, and the second 100 rows are shuffled, and the third 100 rows are shuffled. And this does not impact looking for patterns that shouldn't be there, like I described before, but it does provide protection for privacy in very rare, tiny cases. So let's say I was driving into the parking lot at 6:59 a.m., a minute before the polls opened, and I recognized the first person standing in line. And now, after the election is over and the cast vote record is released, I say, aha, I know how that person voted. No, you don't. Because all you know is that first person in line's vote was one of the first 100. In other words, you don't know how the person voted. So there's no reason to destroy the sequence of the whole set of votes. But in order to protect voter privacy, it's standard practice by the voting machine manufacturers that when they produce a cast vote record report, that they will shuffle in blocks of 100 or 200. So now we have to take a little coarser view and say, okay, after you counted the first 100 votes, how many did each candidate have? And then add to that the next 100 votes, how many did each candidate have? And now you'll get the same answer every time, even if you run another cast vote record report and it happens to shuffle within the first 100, within the second 100, within the third 100, so forth. So the sequence is important because that allows you to see trends, again, patterns which are there that shouldn't be or are not there that should be. So part of my testimony in the Alabama case against the Secretary of State, since Alabama refuses to release any cast vote records. And so part of my testimony there included a whistleblower from Pima County, Arizona, because they also use ES&S. The state of Alabama is 100% ES&S. What the whistleblower testified is that every Democrat candidate in September of 2020, before the election, was promised an extra 35,000 votes. And this was obviously something the whistleblower had never heard before because they immediately started asking questions. Well, won't that be obvious? So save that thought, and I'll come back to the rest of what the whistleblower said. Yes, it would be. So if you were counting votes for two candidates and in a close election, as the votes are counted, the numbers would climb and they might trade places. Who's ahead? I mean, this makes interesting TV. People keep watching. You get to see more ads until midnight when everybody goes to bed. But if you suddenly see one candidate do this, you say, oh, that shouldn't happen. Of course, it did in Wisconsin and Michigan and a few other states, but it didn't happen in Arizona. So I looked and looked and looked, and I could not find 35,000 extra votes. There was not a 35,000 extra for one candidate at the beginning or at the end. There wasn't any big spike. So the answer the whistleblower got, they said, well, if we're all going to get an extra 35,000 votes, won't that be obvious? The answer was, we'll spread it out in blocks of 1,000. And the system will auto-adjust. And the whistleblower sent this email to the FBI, the Department of Justice, and every Arizona legislator. And that's where I got a copy, was from an Arizona legislator. And once I saw that point, that it's going to be in blocks of 1,000, I knew what to look for. And by looking at a window of 1,000, moving through the list of all the roughly 500,000 votes in Pima County, there were blocks that were way out of line with the block before and after it. So if you graphed it horizontally, the ratio of one candidate to the other in blocks ought to be fairly constant. It was a slightly sloping line, not as steep as the one that I described before, but you're chugging along with blocks of 1,000, looking at only this 1,000 kind of a window. It's like you have a section you can look at on your screen and you're scrolling through the spreadsheet. And so it's the 1,000 rows that are visible on your screen at the moment. Then it was going along 2.2, 2.4, 2.3, 6.5. You say, I found the block. So I can actually tell you the ballot numbers for that block that was one of those promised blocks of 1,000 fraud votes that would be spread throughout. So going back to the bank statement comparison, when you get a bank statement at the end of the month, it tells you what your balance is, which is important to know because you've got bills coming up and you want to be sure that you have money in there to write checks on them. But if all the bank sent you was your balance at the end of January is this, your balance at the end of February is this, your balance at the end of March is this, you would be very unhappy with the bank because you don't know if that includes all the checks that you mailed out that haven't been cashed and deposited yet. What you want to see is the sequence of deposits and withdrawals and checks cleared and so forth. So you want to see line by line every transaction. So making the analogy back to the cast vote record, what you want to do is add a column out at the end of the spreadsheet that is the running total. So that's like your running bank balance. So your opening balance is, let's make it simple and say there were just two candidates. So the opening counts are 0 and 0. And then we have one ballot that voted for the first candidate. Now the new balance is 1 and 0. And then we have one vote for the second candidate. And now the new balance is 1 and 1, and so on down the spreadsheet. So you keep the running total and you can see the changes. And now when you look at those totals and you see something like, again, going back to blocks of 100 or 200, when you suddenly see a block of 100 votes for a single candidate in a row, then that's an anomaly that you have to drill down and find out what the reason for. It would be the equivalent red flag of flipping coins and getting 100 heads in a row. You say, I don't really think this should happen. Okay, when you see something that is tightly controlled, so in the case of Pima County, Arizona, all 17 races started at a ratio of Democrat to Republican of about 3-1. So that would be 75% for the Democrat candidate. So it's like 3-1 odds. So out of 4 votes, there were 3 for the Democrat and 1 for the Republican. So it was 75%. And it went almost a perfectly linear slope down to 1.5 to 1, which would be 1.5 to 1 odds would be 3 to 2. So 3 out of 5 ballots would be for the Democrat candidate. 3 out of 5 would be 60%. So we basically had an almost straight line from 75% down to 60%. But there were some fluctuations. And so the fluctuations where it didn't follow the line exactly. Sometimes it was a little above the line, but then it corrected and got below the line and then went a little above the line, but it was getting closer and closer to being right on the line the closer it got to Election Day. So at this point, I was just analyzing the unsorted mail-in ballots, where there should not be any pattern and there should not, especially there should not be a predictable pattern. So when Draza Smith looked at this graph, she is a systems engineer who worked at Los Alamos, where our nuclear weapons are designed. When she saw that curve, she said, "That's a PID controller." And I looked at the curve and I said, "You're right, that's a PID controller." So what's a PID controller? Well, it's proportional integral derivative. It is the simplest closed loop feedback system. So very simple example would be the cruise control on your car. So you set your cruise control for 55. You're driving along on level ground at 55. Your foot's off the gas. The cruise control is holding the pedal the right distance down to run at 55. And you come up on a hill. Cruise control didn't know there was a hill there, but it knows that the speed is dropping. And the speed goes 54, 53, 52. So what does the cruise control do? It says, give it some more gas. We're going too slow. And now you get back up, and now you're going 55 up the hill. And then you crest the hill and you start down the other side. Cruise control didn't know there was a downhill ahead, but it knows you're going 56, 57, 58. It knows you're going too fast. So it says, let up on the gas a little. And so that resonated with me with what the whistleblower said about being told the system would auto-adjust, so that if it was above the track, it would make adjustments to get back on the track, and if it was below, it would make adjustments to get back. And that graph of a 2-to-1 slope reminded me very much of an airplane coming in for a landing when the runway is completely fogged in. So you've got to land the plane, and you've got to land at exactly the right spot, which is the start of the runway. You don't want to land before the start of the runway in the mud. You don't want to land halfway down the runway when you don't have enough room to stop before you run off the other end of the runway. You want to land at the start of the runway, and there is a radio beacon that gives a 3-degree glide slope. So when the airport's fogged in and the plane is coming in, then the pilot pushes a button that says Cat 3 auto land, and the plane gets the beacon and says, where's the start of the runway? Aim for it at a 3-degree glide slope. So the plane can't see anything. It's all fogged in. The plane is headed straight for the start of the runway. And there's a strong gust of wind. And it bumps the plane's nose up. Did the computer know there was going to be a strong gust of wind to bump the nose up? No. But it knows it's not on a 3-degree glide slope, and if it continues this direction, it's not going to land at the start of the runway. And it says, decrease attitude and get back on the 3-degree slope to hit the start of the runway. So in a critically damped system, there would be an immediate correction that would land right on the line and stay there. But designing a controller this way in the real world gives an unstable system. So hold the thought of the airplane coming in for a landing, let's go back to the car. So now instead of the cruise control, it's you, the driver, who are concentrating on staying exactly in the center of the lane. You don't want to drift over into the lane to the left, and you don't want to drift over the shoulder on the right. You want to stay exactly in the center of the lane. And you have such good eyesight and such good reflexes that you can tell you're an inch to the left of the center. And so you turn the wheel. But the car takes a few minutes seconds, I should say, to respond. And now you go back to the center of the lane and cross over, and now you're an inch to the right. And you say, oh no, I'm an inch to the right of the center. And so you turn the wheel to the left. And so what you end up doing when you're trying to correct to within an inch of the center line is you end up driving like this. And that's an unstable system. And so you have to have some, its technical term is hysteresis in it, so that you don't make the whole correction immediately. So now you wait until you realize you're a foot to the left of center, and then you turn what you think will get you within 3 inches of center. And by the time the car responds and you see it, you may be 3 inches to the right of center, but you're closer to the center line than you were. And so what you're doing is you're kind of weaving back and forth on a very small scale, but you're homing in on the center line. So if you had tried to make the full 6 inches, you would probably overshoot. And that would be 100% for the P term, the proportional term. You say, I'm only going to make 60% of the correction now, but now the I term, the integrator, I'm going to remember I've got 4 more inches to go to get back to center, and I'll make that correction later. So the integrator is remembering how much of the error hasn't yet been corrected. The proportional is making some of the correction, but not too much. Again, we have all of these conflicting demands. We want to stay right on the center line, but we don't want to be jerking the wheel twice a second and wearing out our suspension system and the power steering system and all of that. And we don't want to get too far off. So you put all of these together, and it's called tuning the controller. And when I actually designed the PID controller to match the Pima County curve, which started at 3-1, and it had bumps above and below the line, but the bumps alternated being above and below and got closer and closer to the line as they got to election day. Think about what a PID controller does. It attempts to maintain a defined set point. So whether that's the speed on your cruise control or the 3-degree glide slope to the start of the runway on a Cat 3 auto land, it attempts to maintain a specified set point. It also responds to unplanned disturbances. So you may know how many mail-in ballots you stuffed in the drop boxes with 2,000 mules. You don't know how the people who come in to vote early in person are going to vote. And if too many of them vote the wrong way, you need to be able to adjust for that and compensate. And so maintaining a specified set point and responding to unplanned circumstances is exactly what unplanned disturbances is exactly what a PID controller is designed to do. And that is the reality of the election system and the voting system, is that you can print up as many ballots as you want in advance. In France, people make much of many other countries using paper ballots. They discovered that some, I don't know if it was postal workers or the incoming mail clerks receiving the ballots, that the ballots were in a plastic sleeve, which was partially color printed to mask what was inside, but there was enough that wasn't printed that you could push the ballot up in the envelope to see how they voted, and without tearing the plastic envelope, could tear the paper inside, which by French law spoils the ballot. And so they didn't know how many people were going to vote for a particular candidate. But if there were too many votes coming in for the unselected candidate, they knew how many to discard. So PID controllers maintain a specified set point and respond to unplanned disturbances. If you're using the same software on the same computer, why not apply it to all races? And that's exactly what happened in Pima County. So all the way from president, U.S. Senate, state Senate, state House, county sheriff, county recorder, every single one of them started out at about 3-1, 2 big humps, a little hiccup 25% of the way through, and then tracking down to the end. This was on an ES&S machine in Pima County. And let me put 2 races side by side, which are completely different in every respect. So 2 different counties, Pima County, Maricopa County. 2 different machines, ES&S and Dominion. 2 different races. We'll take county sheriff and president in Maricopa County. That means 2 different pools of voters. because due to the settlement of a federal lawsuit, non-citizens in Arizona can vote in federal races. They cannot vote for county and state races. So every state says in their constitution, only citizens of this state may vote, but they can't control federal elections. And so a federal court ruled, the argument went something like, there are all of these illegal aliens in Arizona who are affected by the outcome of the federal elections for president, senator, U.S. House, and therefore they should have a voice in that. So what they get is a special registration card, and they get a special ballot, FRO, federal races only. Okay, so back to my list. So we've got Pima, Maricopa, ES&S, Dominion, county sheriff, president. Only Arizona citizens can vote. Arizona citizens and non-citizens can vote. It was exactly the same curve. Two big peaks, 2-to-1 slope, 25% of the way, there was a little bump, and it tracked on down. In Pima County, 16 of the 17 races were won by the Democrat. One race was won by the Republican with exactly the same curve. And you could speculate different possible reasons that might occur. But what this tells me, this comparison, side-by-side comparison tells me, is that at the bottom, all of the election software is the same. That the difference is in the pretty graphical user interface. Oh, our company has purple buttons on the screen, and it's better than that company that has green buttons on the screen. The model, to be believable, should never exceed the number of registered voters. And in fact, it shouldn't exceed the ordinary average turnout plus or minus a little. So the average turnout in a presidential election from 2000 to 2016 was 53 or 54%. So roughly between 50 and 60%. The turnout in 2020 was about 60%. And so that's higher than average, but it's believable. That is the turnout that is reported when you look at all of the news stories about the election. But they're wrong. Because all of those stories take the number of votes divided by the over 18 population. That's not voter turnout. Voter turnout is number of votes divided by the number of registered voters. Because population over 18 includes people who are eligible to vote but are not registered. It includes non-citizens who legally cannot vote. It includes felons who can't vote. It includes mentally incapacitated people who cannot vote. So the over 18 population is greater than the number of registered voters. So if you take the number of votes reported in 2020 and divide by the over 18 population, 60% is a little higher than the 53 or 54% average, but it's plausible. If you take the reported number of votes divided by the actual number of registered voters, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's over 90%. And that's simply not believable. I've got some oceanfront property in Iowa to sell you.
I believe it was 95%.
Was it 95? Okay. Yeah. And and this illustrates how subtly information can be manipulated. So if you label a table voter turnout, and then in the fine print, you say, this is the number of votes divided by the over 18 population, most people will not notice that that is not voter turnout, because voter turnout is number of votes divided by the number of registered voters. Okay, there's not a lot that's public about the Albert sensor system, but what is public is, to me, very concerning because of the potential vulnerability. So if you tell me that you want your house to be safe, and so you have 2 deadbolts on the front door, but you leave the back door open, then I have to say your house isn't safe. And so there's a vulnerability there that somebody might come in the back door that you didn't want coming in the back door. So the origin of the idea for the Albert sensor goes back to the necessity to automate monitoring computer networks. So in the early days of computer networks, there were point-to-point connections. Harvard had a line that went to MIT, and Stanford had a wire that went to University of California at Berkeley. And so to send an email, you had to specify the sequence of intermediate stops. As networking grew and the protocols became more sophisticated, they developed the idea of breaking messages into packets, and the nodes which were connected would keep track of how reliable and how big bandwidth each adjacent connection had. Every node on the internet knows what nodes are connected most closely to it and how, to use the infamous term, how big a pipe they have to push information through, and then how congested it is. Because if a bulldozer cuts a fiber optic cable and that connection is down, then it will simply reroute it. And this idea of rerouting actually goes back to the long-distance network. Because in the early days of the long-distance network, when it was all owned by AT&T, the one thing they did not want to happen was a call not to go through. Because if the call doesn't go through, they can't charge you for it. So let's say I'm in Dallas and I want to call my friend in Houston. There would have been a certain number of trunks, that's major phone lines between Dallas and Houston, that could handle, let's say, 24 calls at a time. And I'm the 25th person who's trying to make a call to Houston, and all 24 lines from Dallas to Houston are busy. So AT&T doesn't give me a busy signal. They give me a busy signal, I hang up. They say, oh, well, if I can't get it directly from Dallas to Houston, but I've got bandwidth, capacity to send the call to Kansas City, then we'll see if Kansas City has a capacity to get to Houston. And this is why, again, if you're as old as I am, you can remember making a long-distance call. You never knew how long it was going to take before the other phone would ring. Because by the time my call finally got to Houston, it might have gone from Dallas to Kansas City to Denver to Missoula, Montana to Chicago to Little Rock to New Orleans and to Houston. And so I might be listening for a minute before the phone actually rang on the other end. But the call went through and the phone company got to collect. And so modern internet has the same kind of idea, is that if you can't send a packet by the most direct route, it sends it by a detour of the next most direct route, and so forth. And so all of this information gets rerouted. That means that there is a much larger number of points of attack. So denial of service attack, where somebody has a bot army of computers that all say, open your web page, open your web page, open your web page, and it overwhelms your web server where nobody can get through. Then it's beyond what a human being can do to monitor. So you need to have special computers in a network control center that can monitor the computers that you care about, like your web server. So as an outgrowth of that idea, the federal government developed, there was actually a sequence of projects. So one project was called Einstein, and the next project was called Albert. So it was just a convenient acronym that you would have somebody smarter than you watching your computer to make sure nothing bad was happening. So that would be detecting attacks, looking for malware, things like that. Just keeping a monitoring eye on your system. Now, what is it's evolved into now is operated by a public-private partnership, kind of like an NGO called CIS. This is not to be confused with CISA. And CISA is part of the Department of Homeland Security. CIS, the Center for Internet Security, is a public-private partnership which operates the Albert sensor network and interfaces with CISA and Department of Homeland Security on the government side and with the private or at least non-federal operators on the other side, such as county governments, school boards, places like that. So the way it works is let's just say a county decides that they want to have somebody watching their computers and monitoring for attacks and malware and things like that. Then the county will sign a memorandum of agreement, an MOA, with CIS, the Center for Internet Security. And part of that agreement says that they will allow CIS to install a monitoring computer inside the firewall of the county. So county has a lot of computers. These days, every operation, whether it's courts or property deeds or elections, municipal court, traffic tickets, whatever, everything uses computers one way or another. And all of the county computers are protected by a firewall. And a firewall is simply a way of keeping unwanted traffic from either entering or exiting the county. So I've talked about the unwanted traffic coming into a county. You don't want a denial of service attack. You don't want a ransomware attack. And many states across the country right now, as we speak, there is at least one city or county or state office that has been shut down by a ransomware attack. So this is a real threat. It's a real problem that needs to be monitored. So a good firewall that had up-to-date information about where these attacks could originate and what form they might take can block them. So you can block unwanted traffic coming into the firewall. The county firewall is also going to protect unwanted traffic going out. So you don't want county employees going to xxporn.com on a county computer. So the firewall would block that from going out. Now, the firewall has to have tunnels through it for legitimate traffic. And so for your county employees to be able to send an email to a property owner that your new tax assessment is so much and your bill is going to be so much and whatever, they have to be able to send email. That means there has to be a tunnel through the firewall that allows legitimate email to go out and a tunnel through the firewall for legitimate email to come in and so forth. But the fact that there's a tunnel there means there's a hole. So back to the Albert sensor, what its official purpose is to monitor all of the computers inside the county firewall for attacks and malware. Now, part of the memorandum of agreement says that when the county signs this and agrees to put this monitoring computer inside the county firewall, the county will inform all county employees that they have no expectation of privacy. And so what that means is that CIS is not limiting themselves to whatever they might see on any county computer inside the firewall. And that means if the tunnel to CIS is open to all traffic in and out, that if there were a bad actor who conducted what's called a man-in-the-middle attack, because the traffic will go through multiple nodes getting to CIS, if someone at one of those intermediate nodes intercepted it, then they would have a means for forging or attacking. So inside the county firewall would be the county clerk, the county recorder, the county sheriff, and the election administrator. All of their computers would be inside the county firewall. And the Albert sensor is another computer which, because it's inside the firewall, can see all of the other county computers. Yes, absolutely, because unless you take explicit steps to make it a one-way tunnel through the firewall, it's a two-way tunnel. So in the case of the electronic poll books, the legitimate connection to the network is to verify two things: that the person presenting themselves to vote is a registered voter and has not already voted in this election. And in order to do that, it has to communicate with typically the county database or the Secretary of State database to answer those two questions. Is this person registered to vote, and have they already voted in this election? What we saw in Dallas was that about 15 minutes before the polls closed, there was no one in line, and the count of people who had checked in started increasing.
They just jumped again.
All the numbers are jumping.
Sitting here, we're doing nothing, and our numbers are just going.
I jumped from
The last time I put a number in. I'm now at 817.
I'm 1,089 now.
Just jumped to 9 times.
And the worker noticed that, said, "Hey, what's going on here? The number's going up, and we haven't checked in any more voters." And the next poll worker looked at their e-poll book, and the same thing was happening there. And so the fact that there is a two-way connection from the e-poll book to some outside place is the only way that that could have occurred, is that from some outside place, there was a command coming into that poll book to say, check in this voter. As I said, any tunnel through a firewall is by default a two-way tunnel. So you have to take special steps to make it only a one-way tunnel. So just think of it as if you have a door open, then people can come in and people can go out, or dogs can come in and dogs can go out. Or if you have an open window, flies can come in and flies can come out. So we're just talking about access to a system. And so the access where information is going out would be used for monitoring. So I do not know of any legitimate reason to have a modem in a tabulator. So when I put my vote in a scanner, it records it on the hard drive in the scanner. And at the end of election, that is copied to a USB drive. I know of no legitimate reason to have a modem in a scanner. And yet we have found scanners like the DS200s that had modems in them. And one of the reasons that it came to light is because the manufacturer had to upgrade the modem because Verizon had announced they were going to shut down the 3G network, and they were 3G modems. So the manufacturer had to upgrade the tabulators to 4G modems. So that having a modem in a tabulator, to me, I do not see a legitimate purpose for it. I'm open to enlightenment as someone can explain that. The other thing is that a lot of the election operations occur at the precinct level or at a polling place, countywide polling place, which a number of jurisdictions have adopted, which has a lot of problems of its own that we could discuss otherwise. But at the typical county polling place, they actually set up a local area network. And there's an obvious reason for this, because you have a computer which is going to prepare the ballots for a particular voter, and you have to have a printer. Unless every check-in station has its own printer, what you would have is a number of check-in stations and then a smaller number of printers, and they would be connected on a local area network. And where that was a particular problem, being county-wide instead of precinct level, was discovered in Williamson County, Texas, about 2.5 years ago, where because of a flaw in the design of the software, there was sometimes a delay in printing the ballot. So you've got multiple cities in the county who are also holding their own local election for mayor or city council or whatever, in addition to the county-wide and possibly state or federal races as well. So a voter comes in, checks in, the system identifies they are a registered voter, they haven't already voted, and what ballot style they should get. So if they're from Hutto, they should get the mayor's race for Hutto on their ballot. If they're from Georgetown, they should get the Georgetown mayor's race on their ballot. And that was the way it was discovered, is there was a family that went to vote together, parents and a couple of grown children, and when they came out, one of the family members said, "Well, I voted for Joe for mayor. Who did you vote for?" And the other person said, "That's funny. Joe wasn't on my ballot." And what they discovered in tracing it down is that due to a flaw in the 10X software, there was sometimes a delay in the print spooler. So the voter checks in and the poll worker pushes the button that says print and nothing comes out. And the poll worker presses print again, and a ballot comes out. The voter takes it and goes off to the booth to fill it out and so forth. And then another voter checks in, and now the spooler catches up and prints the second ballot. So if the next voter is from a different jurisdiction, they get the wrong ballot. Every person after the first one that was printed twice is off by one. They're getting the previous voter's ballot. And there's no way to fix that. So the results are unknowable and unrecoverable. The election administrators, I think, took 5 months to do a recount. Well, if voters got the wrong ballot, does recounting wrong ballots tell you what the right result was? No. And just last week, he resigned after criminal complaints were filed with the sheriff and the district attorney. There were many, many problems discovered during the Maricopa audit. So in the first place, the Senate subpoenaed the ballots, and the Board of Supervisors delayed 5 months before they delivered the ballots. When they actually delivered them to the Coliseum or wherever it was that they were going to do the audit, out of 1,600 something boxes, all but about 50, the seals were missing or had been broken. There was no chain of custody on them. When they examined the paper, so Maricopa County is the only county in Arizona that uses Dominion. Pima County and much of the rest of the state uses ES&S. I think Yavapai uses Unison, but Maricopa County uses Dominion. And the Dominion has a very specific requirement for ballot paper to be used in a Dominion scanner. And that is, it has to be 80 or 100-pound paper. So your ordinary copy paper is 20, sometimes 25-pound paper. So we're talking about something that's 4 or 5 times thicker than an ordinary sheet of paper. It's almost cardboard. It's like almost postcard type stock. So it has to be 80 or 100-pound paper. It has to be manufactured by the Roland Paper Company in Canada, and it has to have an infrared fluorescent watermark on it. So you may have seen things that glow under ultraviolet light, a UV flashlight, something like that. This is infrared, because inside the scanner, there's an infrared light and a detector to make sure that the ballot that's been inserted is not counterfeit. Because if it is, it can reject that and put it over in another bin and not count it. I mean, let's say that you took a stack of 10 $20 bills into the bank and said, I want to deposit this in my account. Please credit my account with $200. What would the bank do first? They would inspect each of those bills, probably with a little machine. You say, well, there are 10 $20 bills here. So it's worth $200. Add $200 to my account. No, they check to see if they're counterfeit. So doesn't matter how many times you count that stack of 10 bills. If there are 3 counterfeit bills in there, then it's not $200. So you can say, I counted them and there are 10 bills here. You count them. There are 10 bills here. You count them. There are 10 bills here, but it's not $200 worth of bills. So the paper was specified by the manufacturer. The scanner was designed to detect and reject counterfeit ballots. But when the citizen auditors actually got to look at the ballots, they found 9 or 10 different kinds of paper, most of which came from Staples and Office Max. They were not 80 or 100-pound paper. They did not have the infrared ghost taggant from Roland Paper Company in Canada. You say, well, how is this possible that they scanned 2 million ballots and didn't detect and reject the counterfeit paper? It's very simple. There's a configuration setting to turn the detector off. So basically, the machine was set not to check whether the paper being inserted was counterfeit paper. And you can count counterfeit ballots as many times as you want and get the same numbers. But that doesn't mean that they were legitimate ballots, because they weren't.